You protect your expectation that the benefit will continue. As usual, we begin with a story, and here it is today. Dr. Chanchal Goel was recruited under the local self-government department in the government of Rajasthan. By appointment order, it was specified that her recruitment is purely temporary, that is, for a period of 6 months or till she was selected by the Rajasthan Public Service Commission, whichever is earlier. Generally, her continuance could not go beyond 1 year in the absence of the approval of the Service Commission. However, by virtue of successive extension orders, her tenure did not end even after 1 year. Later, on the terms of the government appointment order, she was removed from the post. She took the plea of legitimate expectation. The Supreme Court rejected the plea and ruled that mere continuance in service does not imply waiver of the stipulation mentioned in the appointment order. Into our jurisprudence through PIL, the Supreme Court made use of the doctrine of legitimate expectation. We saw that legitimate expectation can be procedural or substantive. What does substantive legitimate expectation entail? The answer to this question is what we will be dealing with today. The concept, legal basis, and applicability of procedural legitimate expectation are considered straightforward. It only requires that a fair opportunity to be heard be given to the individual who has the legitimate expectation. When the courts applied the requirement that an expectation should be reasonable and that provided a useful limit by negating expectations that they felt were unrealistic or inappropriate. Another issue was whether a person who raised a legitimate expectation needed also to prove reliance upon it, generally influenced by considerations of promissory estoppel. A final consideration was the extent to which the inquiry about applying the legitimate expectation doctrine might focus on the policy itself rather than merely the procedure followed in exercising it. This was a substantive legitimate expectation based on a promise or representation about an actual advantage or benefit, quite different from all forms of the traditional legitimate expectation that are procedural legitimate expectations, because the latter are confined to the procedure to be followed before a decision is made. According to Leland Peter Anthony Gordon's textbook on administrative law, Legitimate Expectations, a substantive legitimate expectation arises where a public body makes a lawful representation that an individual will receive or continue to receive a substantive benefit of some kind. Substantive legitimate expectations refers to a situation in which the applicant seeks a particular benefit or commodity. The claim to such a benefit is based on governmental action which justifies the existence of a relevant expectation. It therefore implies that if a substantial benefit is granted or if the individual is already in receipt of the benefit, then it will be continued and not substantially varied, then it could be enforced. The substantive legitimate expectation goes one step ahead of procedural legitimate expectation by exerting an influence on not just the procedure prior to the decision, but the outcome of the decision itself. Once it is established that the substantive expectation is legitimate, the court will decide whether the authority's decision to revoke the benefit is justified by any overriding public interest, or if the expectation should be fulfilled. When a court establishes that a public authority's decision has breached a legitimate expectation, it may annul the decision and order that the authority fulfill the expectation. A decision is invalidated by the issuance of a quashing order, also known as a certiorari, and often results in the issue returning to the original body to be. A quashing order may also be used to protect a substantive legitimate expectation. It sets aside the decision that frustrates the promise made by a public authority to an applicant, thus binding the authority to fulfill its representation. To direct a public body to fulfill a legitimate expectation, the court issues a mandatory order, also known as a mandamus. This is also a prerogative order which commands a public body to perform a public duty, and it is often used to compel public bodies to exercise the powers given to them. The court may order that the authority should merely reconsider its decision, taking into account the person's substantive legitimate expectation. The payment of damages, monetary compensation by public authority, is relevant to legitimate expectation in two ways. First, if the authority has voluntarily paid damages to an individual for breaching a legitimate expectation, the court could hold that the authority has not abused its power and thus there is no need to compel it to fulfill the expectation. Secondly, it has been suggested that upon finding that the authority has breached a legitimate expectation, instead of ordering the expectation to be given effect, the court could direct the damages be paid. The principle of substantive legitimate expectation, that is, expectation of a favorable decision of one kind or another, has been accepted as part of the English law in several cases. It was first introduced in the 1984 case R versus Secretary of State for the Home Department, ex parte Khan, where the applicant had argued that the government had unfairly failed to apply the criteria in a government circular that outlined when a family could adopt children living outside the UK. It brought forth the idea that at times policy changes are justifiable even if previous consultation had occurred. It is also the first case in which an individual relied on a general policy as opposed to a specific representation or a policy drawn for a closed class of persons as the grounds for the expectation of a benefit. So it shifted the locus standi from a person receiving a specific benefit to a general expectation from a general rule. The doctrine was more completely developed in the High Court judgment of R versus Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food, ex parte Hamble, Offshore Fisheries Limited, 1995. Justice Stephen Sedley attempted to widen the court's protection of legitimate expectation by including substantive protection of a substantive legitimate expectation. The decisive case on this point is R versus North and East Devon Health Authority, ex parte Coughlin, 2001. By the Court of Appeal of England and Wales, where it was held that there can be situations in which expectations generated by promises or representations made by public authorities must be. The Court of Appeal held that having regard to the undertaking given in 93 and Ms. Coughlin's reliance upon it, the decision to close Marden House was unfair and thus an abuse of power. This case is important as it classified types of legitimate expectation. Category A, substantive legitimate expectation, change of policy. The court would apply the Wensbury standard of unreasonableness to these expectations and would only overturn a decision if satisfied that it was entirely irrational or unreasonable. Category B, procedural legitimate expectation, no consultation. In these instances, the court would require consultation with a person affected in accordance with the expectation, after which the expectation could be disregarded. Category C, substantive legitimate expectation, promise having the character of a contract, where the court considers that a lawful promise or practice has induced a legitimate expectation of a benefit which is substantive, not simply procedural. The court will in a proper case decide whether to frustrate the expectation is so unfair that to take a new and different course will amount to an abuse of. Several English cases have invoked the concept of conspicuous unfairness as an explanation of why or how the disappointment of a legitimate expectation may become an abuse of power. In an obiter dictum in Nataraja versus Secretary of State for the Home Department, suggesting that in order for a public body's decision to resile from a legitimate expectation to be lawful, it must be a proportionate response to a legitimate aim pursued by the public body in the public interest. The proportionality test requires 1. That the objective of the action must be sufficiently important to justify limiting a fundamental right. 2. That the action designed to meet the objective must be rationally connected to that objective and not be arbitrary, unfair, or biased on irrational considerations. And 3. The means used to impair the right must be no more than is necessary to accomplish the legitimate objective. And the more severe the deleterious effect of an action, the more important the objective must be if the action is to be just. In their elaboration of the doctrine, courts of the United Kingdom adopted other key aspects of judicial review such as Wensbury unreasonableness, fairness, and abuse of power to justify the existence and the protection of legitimate. In the early cases, while the cases were about benefits, the Supreme Court's approach was about giving the affected party a fair hearing. That is, it was a procedural approach. Thus, in Scheduled Caste and Weaker Section Welfare Association versus State of Karnataka, 1991, when the slum dwellers were challenging the change in policy, and we have already seen this case in the story in a previous video, whereby instead of the whole slum as per the earlier decision, only a part was to be developed, the Supreme Court made it clear that legitimate expectations cannot be denied without giving the people who are going to get affected a fair hearing, but stopped there without going into the efficacy of the policy decision. In Navjyoti Co-op Group Housing Society versus Union of India 1992, and this also we have seen in earlier videos, there was an application for the principle of procedural fairness. In this case, by subsequent decision, the seniority according to the existing list of cooperative housing societies for land allocation was altered. As per the previous policy, the seniority of land allocation was based on the date of the company's registration with the registrar. However, the policy was changed by basing the seniority on the registrar's date of approval of the final list. This altered the incumbent seniority of cooperative housing societies. The Supreme Court held that societies were entitled to a legitimate expectation that even if there was no right in private, past consistent practice in the matter of allocation would define the matter. In this case, for the first time, the courts went into the reasonableness of the decision rather than merely fairness of the procedure, though the unfair procedure was also a consideration. Substantive legitimate expectation was considered in the case of Food Corporation of India versus Mrs. Kamadhenu Cattle Feed Industries. There, the Food Corporation of India invited tenders for sale of stocks of damaged food grains, and the respondent's bid was the highest. All tenderers were invited for negotiation, but the respondent did not raise his bid. Held that though the respondent's bid was the highest, still it had no right to be faulted. The procedure of negotiation itself involved the giving due weight to the legitimate expectation of the highest bidder, and this was fulfilled. This was a case of substantive legitimate expectation. The court considered the question elaborately in Union of India versus Hindustan Development Corporation. Their tenders were called for supply of cast steel bogies. The railways then adopted a dual pricing policy, giving counter offers at lower rate to the bigger manufacturers who allegedly formed a cartel, and higher offers to others, so as to enable a healthy competition. That is, the Supreme Court held that the change into a dual pricing policy was not vitiated and was based on rational and reasonable grounds. In September 1993, the Asian Development Bank agreed to grant a soft loan of US $113 million to the Union of India for funding a project meant to provide digital wireless telecom facility to 36,000 identified villages in eastern UP. The Department of Telecom floated a tender in 96 inviting offers open to Indian and foreign companies. There were 14 offers, including one from the appellant. The rejected claimant filed the appeal against a High Court judgment. These were the facts in Punjab Communications Limited versus Union of India and others, 1999. It was clearly held that the principle of substantive legitimate expectation was accepted by the Supreme Court, and reference was made to Food Corporation of India's case and to Hindustan Development Corporation case stated. The three-judge judgment in National Buildings Construction Corporation versus S. Raghunathan and others was on 1990. The contention of the respondents based on legitimate expectation was rejected in view of the peculiar. It was observed that the doctrine of legitimate expectation had both substantive and procedural aspects. The Supreme Court laid down a clear principle that claims on legitimate expectation required reliance on representation and result in detriment, in the same way as claims based on promissory estoppel. In Bannari Amman Sugars Limited versus CTO, withdrawal of benefits extended to the appellants as subsidy was challenged. The doctrine of promissory estoppel and legitimate expectation were discussed. The cases were remanded back to the High Court for further consideration. The court accepted that under the circumstances already established in Indian jurisprudence, substantive legitimate expectation may arise. In North Delhi Municipal Corporation versus Dr. Ram Naresh Sharma and others, 2021, prior to 31/5/2016, the retirement age was 60 years for the general duty medical officers of the Central Health Scheme. The dentists and doctors covered under Ayush, including Ayurvedic doctors. At that, TNMCC adopted the Government of India order by issuing Office Order dated 30/6/2016 and enhanced the retirement age to 65 years for the allopathic doctors working in the NDMC. Thus, the Ayurvedic doctors were not covered by the Ministry's order dated 31/5/2016. Aggrieved by this order, the Ayush doctors filed petitions in the administrative tribunals, and finally the matter came up before the Supreme Court on appeal. The Supreme Court held that both allopathic and Ayush doctors render service to patients, and there is no rational justification for having different dates for giving the benefit of extended age of superannuation to these medical practitioners. Hence, the legitimate expectation of the doctors to equal treatment and salary arrears cannot be defeated. So in this case, substantive legitimate expectation was fully applied. The Confederation of Ex-Servicemen Associations filed a public interest litigation for a direction to the Respondent Union of India to recognize the right of full and free Medicare of ex-servicemen, their families and dependents on par with in-service defense personnel, and to extend such Medicare for all diseases including serious and terminal diseases, even if treatment for those diseases is not available in the military hospitals. A constitutional bench of the Supreme Court in Ex-Servicemen Association versus Union of India, 2006, stated that under the said doctrine, a person may have a legitimate expectation of being treated in a certain manner, even though he doesn't have any legal. The Supreme Court made a point in this case that doctrine is rooted in the principle of fairness in administrative decision making, akin to the UK position of abuse of power in decision making, being one of the grounds where legitimate expectations can arise. However, as such medical services were never extended to ex-servicemen, the doctrine of legitimate expectation would not apply in this case, the court stated. State of Bihar versus Shyamanandan Mishra on 5th May decision. The High Court quashed and set aside the impugned notification, which provided for the encadrement of the +2 lecturers with the teachers in the nationalized secondary schools, which was found to be in contravention of Article 790 of the Bihar Education Code. The Supreme Court found what was also discernible was that the encadrement through notification dated 23/6/2009 had frustrated the legitimate expectations of the respondents, as was undertaken with the unfair aim to block the respondents' promotion to key positions, particularly in the administrative wing of the Education Department. Such unfairness in state action could not be countenanced. It emerges from this discussion that the elements of a substantive legitimate expectation claim must show the following: the denial of a right guaranteed, or arbitrary, discriminatory, unfair or biased decision, gross abuse of power or violation of principles of natural justice. It must attract the well-known grounds for a claim under Article 14 of the Constitution of India. This was in both the Bannari Amman Sugars case and Punjab communication cases. There must be a consideration of the claimant's legitimate expectation, and if there is an overriding public interest, reasons must be given for the consideration. The duty to act fairly on the part of public authorities entitles every citizen to have legitimate expectation to be treated fairly, and it is imperative to give due importance to such expectation to satisfy the requirement of non-arbitrariness in state action, or otherwise it may amount to abuse of power. This is in the FCI case. The legitimate expectation gives locus standi. In Bannari Amman Sugars versus CTO, it has been held that it is generally agreed that legitimate expectation gives the applicant sufficient locus standi for judicial review, and that the doctrine of legitimate expectation to be confined mostly to a right to fair hearing before a decision which results in negative a promise of withdrawing an undertaking is taken. Though it was held in Ram Pravesh Singh and others versus State of Bihar, the doctrine of legitimate expectation based on established practice can be invoked only by someone who has dealings or transactions or negotiations with an authority on which such established practice has bearing, or by someone who has recognized legal relationship with the authority. Yet the Supreme Court, by fulfilling the legitimate expectation of protection against violence against women in CEDAW, ratified by India, by formulating guidelines against sexual harassment of women in the workplace with the force of law, in the Visakha case, expanded the locus standi to include expectations based on general laws and guidelines to be treated as legitimate. Substantive legitimate expectation in India has mostly been used as an addition to claims of promissory estoppel. Promissory estoppel is a doctrine in contract law which protects a promisee by enforcing a promise, whether it was implemented as a contract or not. Between 1992 and 2012, substantive legitimate expectation was discussed by the Supreme Court in 34 cases, but it was not enforced in even one of them. This was stated by Sanjay Jain and Shirish Deshpande in Public Law Foundation of the Doctrine of Legitimate Expectations in India, published in the 2019 edition of the Indian Law Review. As in most of these cases, either the claim of legitimate expectation was rejected or it was held that the case was not substantive. Even though the SC has in several cases discussed this, it does show that the legal framework of substantive legitimate expectation in India has not developed as much as in other jurisdictions such as the United Kingdom.